the Deputy Attorney General. And the chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, for 5 minutes.
Was Peter Strzok the author, recipient, carbon copy, blind carbon copy on any documents relating to the meeting between Loretta Lynch and Bill Clinton on the Arizona tarmac?
I do not know the answer to that.
Will all of the documents relating to that tarmac meeting be produced in an unredacted format?
Congressman, the Inspector General is handling that investigation, and as I said, we're going to try to accommodate any congressional requests that we can, but I'll have to consult with them before I do.
So if the president declassified the documents, how quickly could they be produced?
If documents are declassified, they could be produced fairly quickly.
Is that like within a week?
Well, it would depend upon the sensitivity of the document. I can't answer.
If they were declassified, I guess they wouldn't be sensitive anymore. So, I mean, could we get them within a week?
Which documents are we talking about,
The documents relating to the tarmac.
Oh, well, I don't know if I don't know if they're classified. I don't know.
No, assuming they're
anything about
declassified.
that.
How quickly would it take to get them from you to us if the president declassified them?
If there are documents that's appropriate to disclose, then we disclose them as quickly as we could.
When did Justice first learn that Nellie Ohr was employed by Fusion GPS?
I do not know the precise date, Congressman.
Can you find that out and get it to us?
Well, if we know it, yes.
Well, we got to find that out, right? I mean,
Yes.
you've got the wife of someone who was one of the top counterintelligence officials in the Department of Justice working for the company that was a pass-through for money from the Democratic committee to Russians to get dirt on the president to discredit him both before and after the election. I feel like it should be a pretty high priority to figure out when that occurred, right?
I don't want to quibble with you except to say that Mr. Ohr is not a counterintelligence official, but yes, I agree with you. In fact, I believe Mr. Ohr is scheduled to testify before one of the committees, or at least to be interviewed next week.
Right, but that doesn't absolve us of the obligation to actually go and find out when his wife started working for these people that wrote this salacious and unverified dossier. So when did the Department of Justice learn of Bruce Ohr's contact with Christopher Steele during the 2016 campaign?
Congressman, I'm reluctant to answer that only because I don't know all the information, and I want to make sure we know all the information before we give any answers.
We too want to know all the information. That's why we keep asking these questions. I mean, again, you've got this person who works at the Department of Justice, whose wife is working for Fusion GPS, and during the campaign, he's meeting with the author of a dossier that Mr. Comey called salacious and unverified. And so I would hope that it would be a top priority to figure out when we first came to know of those meetings. Is that something you can get to the committee?
If we get all the information and we have a firm answer, I don't want to answer any questions until I know all the details.
When did the Department of Justice first learn of Bruce Ohr's contact with Fusion with Glenn Simpson after the election?
Congressman, we have agreed to provide all the relevant documentation to the Intelligence Committee. I haven't seen it all, so I'm not in position to answer it.
So during Mr. Shavitz's questioning, he pretty thoroughly laid out the number of people on Mr. Mueller's team who have financial donations to Democrats, the Clinton-Obama campaigns. I mean, I think over half of the Mueller team donated to either Clinton or Obama. None of them donated to Trump. And so that's either one of two things. Either Mr. Mueller was curating a universe of people who hate the president, or it's just one hell of a coincidence that a whole lot of people had demonstrable bias that we learn more and more about each day. And so you've answered that question by saying, look, people have personal opinions, but that doesn't always influence action. And it's the action that is your responsibility to make sure is not infected by this bias.
Correct.
And I would proffer that, like, when Mr. Strzok goes and changes wording from gross negligence, a crime, to extremely careless, that's not a belief, that's an action. Like, if we can't find out, you won't tell us whether or not taxpayer money was used to go and buy this dossier. If it was, if the FBI was working with the Democratic Party to buy a dossier to discredit the President of the United States, that's not a belief, that's an action. If that dossier was dressed up as an intelligence document and brought to a FISA court, that wasn't a belief, that was an action. If Bruce Ohr is meeting with the author of the dossier during the campaign and the head of Fusion GPS after the campaign, and as you sit here today, you can't tell us when that occurred, those meetings aren't beliefs, they're actions that undermine the credibility of this investigation. And I would certainly suggest that when Mr. Weissman, Mueller's number 2 in this probe, sends an email on his official Department of Justice email to Sally Yates praising her for defying the President of the United States, that's not a belief, that's an action. So my question to you is, like, what do we ultimately have, what do you have to see in terms of the actions of people with demonstrated bias against the President of the United States before you will appoint a special counsel to investigate the clear bias that has infected this investigation?
Well, Congressman, there are a number of different issues that you've raised. With regard to the allegations of bias, as I've explained, our Inspector General is conducting a very thorough review of that. He's the one who identified the text messages. And so I'm confident that's going to be done appropriately. We're going to
Mueller didn't, right? It took the Inspector General doing it. Mr. Mueller didn't find this information.
Well, I don't, Mr. Mueller found it when somebody told him about it, but it was in the text messages, which the IG got access to.
It really makes you wonder how all these people that we're finding all this information about, with all these connections, ended up on his team. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just clarify, though, I do want to make clear with
Gentleman may answer.
Thank you, sir. With regard to oversight, we are working with the Intelligence Committee to try to provide them all the information they need to answer some of those questions. And I don't personally know the answers, but I'm confident that we'll be able to get that information to them.
Well, thank you, but I just want to note here, and I'll take the time right now. I was going to say something at the end, but two things. First of all, the House Judiciary Committee, not the Intelligence Committee, has direct oversight responsibility over the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have, the overwhelming majority of the majority, called for the appointment of a second special counsel to investigate all of this. And I think if that were taking place, that might satisfy a number of us. However, it's not. And even based upon prior conversations that I've had with you, you're aware of this, and you've noted that we certainly have the right and the responsibility to do that oversight. When you talk about providing documents to the Intelligence Committee, I have no problem with your doing that, but all of that information should be made available to this committee as well. Secondly, the Inspector General, his investigation is very important. We support that. It is very encouraging to us that he is doing what I think is good, unbiased work, and we want that to continue. But our investigation does not need to. You may wait for them to draw conclusions, but our investigation does not need to wait on the Inspector General. So again, I thank you for the documents that were provided to us yesterday. There are, as you know, many, many, many more, I think 1.2 million documents that the Inspector General has, and we have a commitment from the Assistant Attorney General, Mr. Boyd, to provide those by January 15. We have asked, we've sent a letter asking for certain information and commitments regarded to that January 15 production date, but that is very important for us, and we do not intend to wait on the Inspector General's report, whenever that may be, maybe before then, maybe after then, to pursue the investigation that this committee is pursuing. So as long as we have that understanding and that you live by the commitment that has already been made to be fulsome in your production of documents, I have no problem what you provide to the Intelligence Committee, but don't look at it as something just provided them. It should be provided to this committee. If it needs to be handled in camera, if it needs to be handled in a classified manner, we have the facilities, and we are certainly prepared to make the necessary commitments to do that.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate, if I may further explain, I have instructed our staff to make sure they do make this information available to you as well, and my understanding is that they're seeking to make arrangements with your staff to do so this month.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today, sir. Last night I was discussing the importance of this hearing with my teenage daughter. She's in civics right now. And I reminded her that it was 240 years ago when John Adams was trying to explain the difference between an empire and our fledgling republic, and he famously summarized, "We're a nation of laws, not of men." And I reminded her that the founders understood that all men are fallen, we're flawed, and that we have a natural instinct. People have a natural instinct to benefit their friends and seek retribution against their political enemies. And that's a dangerous instinct when it's exercised by someone in a high position of authority at the Department of Justice, obviously. So the founders gave constitutional authority to Congress to monitor all this and to monitor those who are in responsibility so we can maintain the rule of law. And as has been mentioned here today in the hearing, the survival of our republic depends on that. So there's been a lot of discussion this morning about biases of some members of the Mueller team, and we've expressed our serious concerns about former FBI Director Comey's investigation of Hillary Clinton's illegal use of a private server. Of course, it's been mentioned, federal regulations strictly prohibit, for obvious reasons, any DOJ employee from participating in a criminal investigation or prosecution if the employee has a personal or political relationship or affiliation with any person under investigation. Reports have shown, and it's been mentioned this morning, that the lawyers on Mueller's team have contributed more than $62,000 to Democratic candidates and only $2,750 to Republican candidates. The question is, isn't it reasonable for us to assume that there's an inherent bias there?
Congressman, I appreciate that question. I have teenage daughters, and I've had the same sorts of conversations with them. And I can assure you, Congressman, that although I understand the basis for the concern, as I explained earlier, Director Mueller and I have a lot of experience as managers in the department, and we understand our responsibility to make sure that nobody's personal opinions are improperly allowed to impact the investigation. So I can assure you that I've discussed that with Director Mueller, and he's taking appropriate steps to make sure that his investigation is not affected by any bias.
What are those appropriate steps? I mean, let us know what that looks like. I know you've explained it a little bit, but just
Yes, sir.
for my daughter back home, what does that look like?
I appreciate it. I think there's several aspects to it. Pardon me. Number one is the tone that you set around the office of making clear to everybody that although they may have personal political views, it's not to factor into their work and they're not to discuss it in the context of their work. Number two, it's the process that we have within the Department of Justice. Nobody does anything on their own. Everything is subject to review, and the more significant the matter, the higher level the review, and the more people are involved in reviewing it. And of course, we have external checks as well. We have our Inspector General, our Office of Professional Responsibility. And for any matters that we bring, of course, in the Department of Justice, we need to be prepared to prove our case in court beyond any reasonable doubt, so you need admissible evidence. So there are several levels of checks within the department.
In 2014, speaking of the processes, Attorney General Eric Holder announced a significant policy shift concerning electronic recording of statements. And there was established at that time a presumption that the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies will record all interviews of witnesses and suspects. The question is that policy still in place today?
I believe that the policy had to do only with custodial subjects, that is, somebody who's in custody of the FBI, not with mere witnesses.
With regard to the interview of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton about her email server in 2016, was that recorded? Do you know?
I have no personal knowledge of that. My understanding from what I've read in the media is no.
Could you find that out for us specifically?
Certainly.
If it was not recorded, would you have any idea why that would not have been recorded under that policy?
I think the norm would be for a non-custodial interview not to be recorded. That's my understanding.
If it was her email server, wouldn't it be implied that she was a custodian of?
No.
Not at that time?
That policy only applies to folks who actually have been arrested and are in custody at the time of the interview.
That's not the way I understood that policy, but I'll defer to you on that. But if you can't get us follow-up information on that, it'd be helpful. Earlier this year, certain names of individuals were apparently illegally leaked who were caught in a FISA surveillance investigation, and obviously, when something like this occurs, it's absolutely irresponsible and egregious that a leak on that level would ever happen. Can you inform this committee on what is currently being done within the DOJ to investigate potential FISA leaks? Just emphasize that for us.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. The Attorney General has made it a very, very high priority for us to pursue any leaks that are in violation of the law. So when we receive a referral from an intelligence agency that they believe there's been a leak of information within their jurisdiction and that they believe a criminal investigation should be conducted, we give that a very high priority. We've set up a new unit within the FBI to conduct those investigations, and we have attorneys within our National Security Division who are specializing in that, and we are monitoring those cases to make sure that they move expeditiously. Obviously, as you know, there are challenges in proving a leak case, but we are giving those extraordinary attention.
I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.